Hey guys, it's Libby, and today I'm going to look at some more historical costumes on book covers and see how well they stack up. So since it is Victober, and since it was requested by Rachel from Kalanati, I'm going to be talking about Gail Carriger's books. The most famous is Soulless, the first novel of the Parasol Protectorate series, but she's written several series throughout the Victorian period. And I'm actually kind of whacking myself on the head right now because when I recorded my last video in this series, which was about Regency romance, I actually had my Regency dress with me, and I totally could have put it on, and I did not because I am a knucklehead. So I've attempted to achieve something of a late Victorian look for this video. I have not done any late Victorian yet, so I've got this sort of 70s influenced blouse and an athletic top, which is substituting for a waistcoat. Did I do it? Did I Victorian? My hair should be up. This video is going to be slightly different than my previous videos in this series because Gail Carriger does not write straight historical fiction. She writes gaslamp fantasy, which is a sort of literary spin-off of steampunk. So if you don't know what steampunk is, it is a location in the collective unconscious, if you will, which is the Victorian era, but instead of harnessing the power of electricity, people got really advanced steam-based technology, and so the aesthetic is based on steam power. There's lots of sort of cogs and gears, lots of brass. And steampunk originally started out as a design aesthetic, mainly in like fashion and fashion accessories, and then sort of moving into like furniture, and art, and it also has a presence in literature. There are steampunk novels. Gaslamp fantasy is technically it's the fantasy version of steampunk, so you incorporate in fantastical elements, so people use magic, there may be werewolves and vampires and elves. So since we are in a steampunk world rather than a historically accurate world, it's going to be a little bit harder for me to rate these on historical accuracy because they're not historically accurate, and that's the point. So I'm going to be evaluating these costumes on historical plausibility and sort of consistency within the story's own universe, and just aesthetics. I've selected a couple of books from across the different series based entirely on how high quality of an image I could get on Google Images, so you will be able to actually see all the details that I'm talking about. And I think each of the series is set in a different decade, where they sort of cover different generations, so we will get a good look at the second half of the century. And now, usual disclaimer for these types of videos, the authors do not have control over their book covers, or if they do, they have very little, so it is not Gail Carriger's fault if I say that any of these book covers are bad. Even if the covers are bad, that does not mean that the books inside are bad. Having said that, I have actually read the first book in the Parasol Protectorate, and I was not particularly impressed. I think I am the only person on BookTube who has that opinion, so please don't bite me. So we're going to start off with the OG Parasol Protectorate series and take a look at the very first book, Soulless. Now, the cover images for the Parasol Protectorate series, I'm like 99% sure are photographs that were not taken to be the covers of these books. I'm pretty certain that I had seen these images on like Pinterest when I was interested in steampunk in my early costuming days. I'm not creative enough to do steampunk. And I saw them outside of the context of these covers, so that explains why there are different women on each of the covers, even though they're all supposed to be the main character, Alexia Terabody. That also explains why they are all supermodel sized as opposed to plump, which is how Alexia is described. So let's take a look. Reminder that these are set in the 1870s, and the 1870s was a decade with a lot of change in skirt shape. It looks like, I mean, the words are on top of the bustle part, but it looks like we're in the mid to later 1870s when you move into the natural form, where you don't have the big bustle coming off the back. Although the skirt shape is natural form, the cut of the bodice reads as more late bustle to me, so like early to mid 1880s. It's monochrome, it's got these tailored cuffs. Aside from the horrible fit, my main reaction to this is a reaction that I have to a lot of costumes on book covers, and that is that it's just so boring. It's just all one color. The Victorians were much more exciting. But in this case, visually, I do think it works pretty well to have this like pop of color on the black and white background. So, gosh, okay. I think I'm gonna give this a C+. Most of the points are being taken off for just how badly the bodice fits the model. Moving on to another Parasol Protectorate novel, this is Changeless. Okay, so again, super monochrome. This does fit better, but it still doesn't fit great. And we actually have the same lace at the neckline that we had for Soulless. You know, guys, I would believe that this is just the same dress on a model that it fits better and it's been recolored. There is some weirdness going on with the fit of the overskirt. So the typical bustle era outfit has three components: a base skirt, a bodice, and an overskirt, which has a sort of apron front and then a sort of explosion out the back. The main variation on this theme was the polonaise, which is where the bodice and overskirt are combined. It creates a sort of longer line going down to the knees, and you don't have the breakup of the waistline. But I gotta take my glasses off for this. What it looks like is going on here, you can see that the bodice ends, and then something happens. And then the overskirt starts. So I think maybe we're seeing a little bit of the underskirt showing through right at the hip, which means that like the apron is sitting like awkwardly low. That's a bit strange. Now moving on to our third Parasol Protectorate novel, it is Timeless. I don't think that this is the third one in the series, but it's the third one that I could get a good picture for. Okay, so this bodice is actually a lot more like Edwardian. It definitely seems like that's what the designer of this blouse was going for, with like all the ruffles and the insertion. Oh, I forget who my audience is. Insertion is a decorative practice of adding lace in this like complicated way that doesn't matter to a piece of fabric. So she's got an insertion based sort of yoke to her blouse. Now looking at this underbust corset, I know underbust corsets are like super popular in steampunk. This one is kind of ugly and does not fit very well at all. Also, I'm pretty sure that's a zipper in the front. Don't you want some like sexy lacing? So underbust corsets are a lot easier to fit because you don't have to take the size of the bust into account. And they are super popular in the steampunk costuming scene. However, the Victorians did not wear them, and like I'm down with steampunk, but I think steampunk still has to be like consistent, at least internally consistent. So if you're saying like in the year 1855, people developed much more advanced steam-based technology. In what way does this lead to women wearing corsets that don't cover their boobs? What's the step 2 there? Okay, now looking at the skirt, it's a little bit hard to see at the bottom what's going on, but it looks like there is either a ruffle or it's a sort of angled skirt. Which are both later. Those are 1890s things. So it looks like they've taken an 1890s skirt and like plopped over it this like kind of cheap looking this could be either early bustle or late bustle overskirt. The fact that it's in this like dull monochrome points me towards late bustle, but it's a little bit more ruffly than you would expect to find in late bustle. Also, I mean, not a huge biggie, but I can totally see that the model is wearing like a black sports bra or tank top under her shirt. I can see it through the lace. That's just not professional. And I don't think these pictures were like meant to be taken as part of a professional photo shoot for book covers. But then why did you use them as book covers? I mean, I just think this is kind of an ugly mishmash, and I'm giving it a C-. Okay, now we're moving back in time to the 1850s for the Finishing School series. I believe I have all 4 of these. Yes, we will get to talk about all 4 Finishing School covers. Okay, so 1850s. I really wish that I had a more specific year, but okay, I'm gonna go see if I can find one. Okay, no, unfortunately I cannot find a more exact dates for these. So the reason I wanted to know is because something very important in fashion history happened in 1856, and that is the invention of the crinoline. So big skirts had been getting more and more popular throughout the 19th century, and originally these had been created by just layering on more and more petticoats, and like starching the petticoats and adding cord to the petticoats. But in 1856, some guy whose name I forget patented the cage crinoline, which is constructed with like wires to hold the skirts out from you, and it allows you to get a much bigger skirt shape with much less inconvenience. And all of the skirt shapes in the Finishing School series are really quite big. They're like a little too, they're definitely too big for 1850s. They're just not proportioned well for 1860s, which is when skirts got to be at their biggest. Think Scarlett O'Hara. So, I mean, looking at Etiquette and Espionage, and this is where, like, my training of looking at all of these fashion plates and photographs from the actual 1850s and 60s is telling me that the skirt shape is just slightly off. I think if I were to see the entire skirt, like waist to floor as opposed to waist to sort of knee, I would say it comes out too far too fast and then just drops. You kind of want a consistent dome and not did the sound effect help? And also on this one, the skirt is a little bit too backward focused. It's definitely sticking out more in the back than in the front and presumably at the sides, which is a more like later 1860s look as you sort of start to transition into the bustle. 1850 skirts, remember, they're based on what you could create with petticoats. So they're pretty evenly spaced all the way around, and they're quite dome shaped. They're not really straight or conical or balloony, which is what we have here. Okay, so that's me rambling on and on about the skirt. The bodice, which is the case of all of the bodices in this series, are from the 1890s. Which is kind of what people think of when they think Victorian. That's why, like, when I was like, oh crap, I need to immediately make a Victorian looking costume, I made this, which is kind of a 1890s looking thing. But the combination of like 1890s above the waist, 1860s below the waist makes for a very strange look. I don't know if this silhouette looks super weird to you guys, but it looks super weird to me. Okay, first off, obviously, we're going to talk about it. She's not wearing a corset. This is a modern boob shape. It's low and it's round. A Victorian boob would be a lot higher in the 1870s, or sorry, in the 1890s, which is when this shirt is trying to be from. It would be a little bit lower in the 1860s. I know it's set in the 1850s, but there's nothing 1850s about this, so I'm just going to follow the skirt line and say 1860s. It was a little bit lower in the 1860s, but because of the corsetry, like, you were sort of creating an entire torso that just goes like in, it just sort of does this. Is this helpful? It's not like you have a torso and then you have skirts and you have boobs stuck onto the torso. You have like a whole torso shape that is sort of curving in towards the waist together. And this really just looks like a mannequin that you stuck some boobs on. And it also looks strange because like they're so low, they're closer to the waist than to the shoulders. It's just very strange. And then, do I think all the ruffles are ugly? Yes, of course I think all of the ruffles are ugly. I mean, just on, like, aesthetics, giving that a D+. Yeah, her like hair and makeup is put together. I mean, it's not related to the Victorian period at all. That's like we got like a 40s pin curl going on. But that's at least put together. So D+ for this one. Okay, moving on to Curtsies and Conspiracies. Again, a little too much outward thrust on the skirts. I like this bodice a little bit better. I would believe that someone might actually wear this in the 1890s. It looks quite homemade, and by that I mean cheap. Like, the fabric is cheap, the seams are wrinkling a bit, the trim is pretty clearly just slapped on. But I like the basque going on, which is the sort of peplum that's attached to form like a little skirt part of the bodice. The collar looks better fitted, and yeah, this is okay. I give it, ooh, I just noticed something. Okay, that's gonna make me give it a C-. So with all of these skirts in this series, but especially with this one, this does not look like it was like made to be a skirt with like the gathering or the pleats equally spaced across the skirt, or even just mostly smushed to the back, which are the two things you'll find in like most historical periods. The gathering is really awkward. There's this one like profusion of pleats right down the front, and then much less fabric coming out of the waistband on either side. And I would totally believe that the model is like not wearing an actual skirt. They just like took some fabric and sort of like smushed it into the waistband just for this photo shoot. So yeah, C-. Okay, moving on to Waistcoats and Weaponry. This one is weird. Again, skirt, too much of an outward thrust. These gloves I am reasonably okay with. This sort of glove was you could see worn in the 1840s as a fashionable item, so it might be a little bit out of date for the 1850s, but you could still totally wear it. Sometimes your forearms get cold, I feel ya. It's just this like overdress thing. It is just so very strange. One, it doesn't fit. I can see her chemise at the neckline, which is very naughty. I can also like sort of see into her armpit, which means that this bodice doesn't fit. And also, like, is that supposed to be sexy? Everyone is looking out for a glimpse of pit. So the really strange thing about this bodice is that it's got the opening on one side of the skirt, and then the lacing on the other side of the bodice. Like, it would almost make sense if you had it so that they were both on the same side, so that like this side is open and like that's how you put it on, and then you lace it up. That would make sense. This does not make sense. Why would you could have made it so that it was just like a jacket that you put on and then lace up, but instead you still have to like awkwardly clamber through it in order to get it on. But then you've made this slit in the skirt on the other side. It's weird and confusing. Let's stick a big honkin' belt over it, which looks like it would be much more at home on like an expedition to Abyssinia than in a finishing school. And then we'll top it off with a hat that honestly looks like a sheer eye shade to me. Why would you make an eye shade that is sheer? I don't know. I know that I'm talking a lot about historical accuracy, which I said I wasn't going to do because this is a fantasy world and I should let people's imaginations run wild. But like, here's the thing about sticking to historical accuracy. I mean, aside from like the early 1830s and the 1610s, there has never been a time in Western fashion where people just looked like utterly ridiculous. Oh yeah, in the 1980s. And even in the early 17th century, it just sort of looped around so that it was so ugly that it went back around to being kind of weirdly appealing. So all of the things that I'm calling historically inaccurate, I'm also calling ugly, and I think it would have looked nicer if you had just stuck with, you know, what may perhaps be more boring but would have been more accurate. What I would have done with this cover is take the weird thing off of her head, ditch the belt, and ditch this like overskirt bodice thing. It looks like she's got something on underneath. I would believe that at some point there's a scene in this book in which someone runs around with her bodice off but her skirt on. Just say it's a picture of that. Yeah, D+. Okay, moving on to the last one in the series, Manners and Mutiny. Okay, so the bodice for this one does look kind of more structured, which is good. Her boobs are up higher. There's some like shape going on. Is this? Oh no, of course. I start complimenting something and then I see what's going on. I mean, maybe it's just the perspective and the fact that there's words in front of it, but this looks really flat. This looks like a flat skirt, not a round skirt, which is off by really just a lot of decades. We weren't doing flat skirts since like the 1770s, so you are 80 years out of date, hun. Okay, the bodice itself, if we ignore everything below the waist, is like kind of weird, but fine for a steampunk world. And I'm just done with this series and I want to move on to another decade. So I'm calling this one, also her earrings are super modern. I'm calling this one C for a bodice that fits. Okay, now we are moving on to the Custard Protocol, which is set in the 1890s, and we are starting off with Prudence. Okay, first thing I see, so much eye makeup. Again, like, it's your fantasy world, do whatever you want. But like, be consistent. Have an explanation for why, like, we have advanced steam technology, makeup becomes okay. Because the Victorians were not about the makeup. That is for loose women. Are you a loose woman, Prudence? Didn't think so. I hope not. I don't know. I haven't read this book. Maybe she is. And also in the one book in this whole collection of series that I have read, I don't think they talked about anybody wearing makeup. So this is totally the cover artist venturing off into their own world. I think Gail is being consistent. So this is like a quite elaborate bodice we have going on here. It looks slightly less cheap than the ones in the previous series. There's a lot of lace going on in the throat area. That's all pretty good. If this were not in a fantasy world, I would say she needs to put her hair up, but we are in a fantasy world, so do whatever you want. The main thing I'm noticing is that this skirt shape is pretty much the same as the Parasol Protectorate skirt shape. Like a little like bare hint of bustleness and lots of sort of rufflage going on around the hips. And this book series is, I'm pretty sure, about Alexia's daughter, who is born at some point during the Parasol Protectorate series. So at least like nearly 2 decades must have passed since that time period. Why do the clothes look exactly the same? But just like from an aesthetic level, this is so much better than the last ones that I think I'm gonna give it a B. Okay, moving on to Competence, which is the next Custard Protocol. This one, she's wearing much less makeup, and her hair is really quite good for the 1890s with this poofage, as is her bodice. She's got a bit of poof to her sleeve, and then it's tight below with a cuff. That's all pretty good. It looks like this is like a jacket over sort of acid green blouse. The jacket and the skirt match. There's this piping detail in this pink, or maybe that's orange, around the cuff and the collar. The colors are incredibly garish, but not that much more garish than you actually would have found in like the second half of the 19th century. They developed a lot in terms of dye technology. So, you know, especially if we're existing in a world with more advanced technology than the actual Victorians had, I totally believe that you could get this ridiculously ugly shade of green. So I'm actually giving this an A. I think this one is well done. Okay, and now we're going to finish off by talking about one of Gail Carriger's novellas so that I can give some love to The Gentleman. I know this has been a very women's wear focused episode, but we're going to get to some menswear right at the very end, and we're going to talk about Romancing the Werewolf, a Supernatural Society novella. Okay, so The bad thing about this one is that these are very obviously modern dress shirts. Ever since roughly the French Revolution, men's fashion has been much more conservative than women's fashion. It has evolved a lot more slowly. So men's dress wear today is pretty similar to men's dress wear 100 years ago. So not that much has changed in terms of the cut of the shirt, but I can tell like that the fabric is just cheaper because of the way it's wrinkling. And also the fact that it is wrinkled. If you're a gentleman, you should have a valet or something to iron your shirts. Also, the guy who's facing us, he's wearing a black t-shirt under his dress shirt. What is that? We had this problem earlier with Timeless or Changeless or whichever one. Like, who is telling their models to wear black under their white costumes? What I really wanted to talk about here is this like fabulous laced waistcoat that we have. I think this is taking the goal or the idea of steampunk and putting it to good use. Taking a historical artifact and saying, well, if people were different in this specific way, how would this artifact have evolved differently? And in this case, we appear to be existing in a queer embracing world. And so we've got this like men's waistcoat, which has acquired elements of women's wear and corsetry, which is both believable and looks really good. And I also like that there's like piping on the sides. The late Victorians were really into piping. I totally buy it. I love this. I mean, I wish they'd worn different shirts, but A-. Okay, well, I'm glad those last two were so good because I was kind of getting depressed in the middle there with the 1850s stuff. But those last two perked me up quite a bit. I'm feeling good. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I will see you again soon.